Your account dips $4 below zero on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the time you check your phone Wednesday morning, the bank has already charged you $32.75 for the privilege of being briefly, momentarily broke. You call to ask for it back. The person on the other end sounds genuinely sympathetic. She also can't do anything about it unless you specifically ask for a waiver, which, statistically, most people never think to do. You're not imagining that this feels arbitrary. It is arbitrary in the sense that it's a policy, not a law of physics. And the same bank charging you $32.75 today waived an identical fee for someone else an hour ago on the same overdraft for the same amount because that person happened to ask and happened to have slightly more money sitting in a different account down the hall. Industry surveys suggest roughly 70% of customers who actually ask for a fee waiver get one. The catch is that only about 1 in 4 customers ever ask at all, which means the arbitrary system is really just a system that quietly rewards the people who already know the rules. This is the bottom rung of a ladder most people never realize they're standing on. Every bank in the country quietly sorts its customers into tiers based on how much money they keep on hand. And the tiers are invisible until you cross into one. No announcement, no ceremony, just a different phone number to call and a different set of rules that apply to you now. Nationally, banks collected $12.1 billion in overdraft and insufficient funds fees last year alone, almost entirely from customers who never crossed into the tier where those fees simply stop applying. You don't know yet that 6 figures in the right account unlocks a personal banker who calls you by name. You don't know that 7 figures unlocks preferred mortgage rates nobody advertises. You don't know that 8 figures unlocks a version of banking that doesn't feel like banking at all. You just know you're out 32.75, and somewhere in the same building, someone isn't. Years later, for reasons that have nothing to do with that 32.75 and everything to do with a raise, a bonus, and a decision to actually keep money in one place instead of spreading it thin, your average daily balance crosses $150,000. Nobody sends you a notification. What happens instead is a phone call. A real person, introducing herself as your dedicated Chase private client banker, saying she noticed your balance and wanted to walk you through some options. The overdraft fee that once cost you $32.75 doesn't disappear because you're smarter now. It disappears because you crossed an invisible line that makes the bank treat the identical mistake differently. Outgoing wire transfers, once $8 or $15 each, are waived. You're assigned not just a banker, but quietly a JP Morgan private client advisor. Access to the investment side of the same institution, something that was never mentioned when you had a regular checking account, because it was never relevant to offer it. The mortgage rate you get quoted the same week you start looking at a slightly bigger place comes in a fraction of a point lower than the rate your coworker got quoted a month earlier at the exact same bank on a comparable loan. Neither of you asked why. You didn't know to ask, and she didn't know there was a different number to ask for. What strikes you most isn't the money you're saving, though it's real. It's how quiet the whole system is about the fact that it exists at all. No billboard tells you $150,000 is the number. No form explains what changes. You just get a phone call, and afterward, a version of the same bank that behaves like a slightly different institution. The Chase private client tier turns out to have its own ceiling, one you find by accident, when a colleague, someone you assumed banked the same way you did, mentions almost casually that her private banker got her into something you've never heard of, a rate on a securities-backed loan that sounds almost fictional. You ask around. The number that keeps coming up across several institutions sits somewhere between $1 million and $5 million in assets. And at Bank of America specifically, the threshold is $3 million in liquid assets, though notably, they'll combine your Bank of America checking with your Merrill investment accounts to get you there, which tells you something about how badly they want to count you in. Other institutions draw the same line in slightly different places. Citigold Private Client and First Citizens both run their own version of this tier, each with its own private minimum. None of them published anywhere a regular customer would ever think to look. Once you cross it, the relationship stops feeling like banking and starts feeling like account management in the literal sense. Someone is now actively managing the relationship, not just servicing it. Preferred rates on new lines of credit, bonus interest on savings that a retail customer checking the same bank's public rate sheet would never see advertised anywhere. A single point of contact who can move money between checking, investing, and lending products without you filling out 3 separate forms across 3 separate departments. You start to understand something you didn't at the $150,000 mark. This isn't one threshold you cross once. It's a series of doors, each one requiring a specific undisclosed number. Each one opening onto services that were true the entire time, just never offered to you before you happened to ask the right person, at the right balance, on the right day. Somewhere past $10 million in investable assets, the conversation changes again. And this time, you're the one who notices it changing before anyone tells you why. An institution like JP Morgan's actual private bank, a different division entirely from the private client tier you crossed into years earlier, requires that $10 million minimum specifically. And it exists because the bank has decided correctly that clients at this level need something categorically different from preferred rates and a dedicated phone line. What you get instead is access to investment structures that were never mentioned at any tier below this one. Direct allocations into private equity funds, customized lending against concentrated stock positions, estate and tax planning coordinated directly with the bank's own specialists instead of referred out to someone else's firm. The banker you're assigned now isn't managing your checking account. He's coordinating with your accountant, your estate attorney, and occasionally your family on structures that took the bank decades to build and that a retail customer will never be told exist because there was never a reason to tell them. Some of these arrangements involve a whole small team assembled around one household, a trust specialist, a tax strategist, an investment officer, coordinated as if your family were a business account. Because at this size, in every way that matters to the bank, you effectively are one. You notice too that the further up you go, the less the bank actually advertises any of it. There's no brochure for this tier the way there was a web page for Chase Private Client. The information moves entirely through relationships. Your $3 million private banker mentions at exactly the right moment that there's a next level and makes an introduction, and the introduction is the entire marketing budget for a service that manages some of the largest personal balance sheets in the country. Past a certain point, the private bank itself starts referring you somewhere else entirely, not because it can't serve you, but because your situation has outgrown what any single institution, however sophisticated, can coordinate alone. Private banks typically begin offering family office-style services once a client crosses somewhere between $10 million and $25 million. Bundling investment oversight, tax coordination, and estate planning into something that resembles, but isn't quite, an independent family office. Beyond that, real multifamily offices, firms built specifically to serve several ultra-wealthy families on shared infrastructure, typically look for clients starting around $25 million to $50 million. charging somewhere between 0.5 and 1.0% of assets annually, plus retainers, in exchange for a team that treats your finances the way a private bank's UHNW division does, but without any single bank's products dictating the recommendations. If you've followed every level of this system so far, the parts nobody explains, the thresholds nobody publishes, this is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to map out. A subscribe genuinely helps more people see it. No pressure, but I'd appreciate it. What becomes clear at this level is that your bank stops being a meaningful phrase. You might still have an account at the same institution you opened at 18, but the actual work of managing your money now happens through a separate firm, coordinating with that bank as one vendor among several, rather than as the center of the relationship. The invisible ladder you started climbing over a $30.75 overdraft fee has led you somewhere the original bank can facilitate, but no longer fully controls. Past $100 million, the math changes one final time, and this time the shift isn't about which bank or which firm you use. It's about whether you need a bank relationship in the traditional sense at all. Single-family offices built to serve one family exclusively generally become viable once assets clear the $100 million mark, largely because the operating cost of running one properly, a dedicated team of accountants, investment staff, legal counsel, and administrators, can exceed $1 million a year on its own. A fixed cost that only makes sense once the assets being managed are large enough to absorb it without anyone noticing the drag. Recent tracking puts the number of single-family offices in the United States at around 1,500, though older estimates in the 3,000 to 5,000 range still circulate. A reminder that even counting how many of these structures exist is itself a somewhat invisible exercise. At this level, your bank becomes one relationship among dozens that your own staff manages on your behalf, alongside custodians, outside counsel, and investment managers you may never personally speak with. The overdraft fee that started this entire ladder, the one that cost you $32.75 and briefly infuriated you, is now something your family office would resolve, if it could somehow ever occur again, through a phone call from someone on your payroll to someone at a bank that stopped treating your family like a customer years ago and started treating it like a relationship to be retained at nearly any cost. You realize, looking back, that every level of this ladder was the same institution making the same calculation about you, over and over, at increasingly generous terms. Not because you became a fundamentally different person between the overdraft and the family office, but because the number attached to your name kept changing what the calculation concluded. You still remember the exact amount of that first overdraft fee with a clarity you don't have for most of the numbers that came after it. $32.75, a Tuesday, a phone call that went nowhere. You don't remember the precise threshold where Chase Private Client became less useful than the next tier up, or the exact month your relationship manager quietly introduced you to someone at a multifamily office instead of continuing to handle everything herself. The thresholds blur, the way all thresholds do once you've crossed enough of them. What you remember instead is the pattern underneath all of it. At every single level, the bank already had the better rate, the waived fee, the more sophisticated structure sitting there the entire time, available to someone. It was never a question of the bank deciding to treat you better as a reward for loyalty or good behavior. It was a question of which invisible line your balance happened to sit on a given day, and whether anyone in the building had a reason to mention it to you. You think sometimes about the version of yourself who got charged $32.75 and called to complain, genuinely confused about why the answer was no. That person wasn't being mistreated by a broken system. He was simply on the wrong side of a threshold that every single tier above him had already quietly crossed. One invisible door at a time, each one indistinguishable from the last until you happen to be standing on the right side of it. The strangest part, looking back across every level, is that nothing about the underlying product ever really changed. It was always just money, sitting in an account, waiting to be moved. Only the door it was allowed to walk through kept getting wider. If you've made it through every level of this, the overdraft fee, the private client tier, the private bank, the family office referral, you're probably already asking the obvious next question. What does it actually look like once a family builds that structure themselves instead of renting a piece of someone else's? That's a different video entirely, and we've already made it. Watch our episode on every level of a family office. It picks up exactly where this one ends, at the point where a bank stops being the center of the relationship and becomes just one vendor among many, managed by a team that answers to the family alone.